Phoenix, Saturday, December 2nd, 1989. At the city's Metro Center Mall, thousands of holiday shoppers crowded the stores and walkways. At around 2 p.m., a man named Jim Stiers alerted mall security to a problem. He said a young boy in his care, 4-year-old Christopher Milke, was missing. Security guards and store employees fanned out to look for the boy, who was the son of Stiers' 25-year-old roommate, Debbie Milke. The mother gave a telephone interview from Arizona's Perryville prison. She says on that afternoon, she was at her apartment when she received a phone call from her roommate, Stiers, who regularly cared for her son.
He said that he and Chris had gone to use the bathroom in Sears, and that when Jim was finished, he couldn't find Chris anywhere. This is a crowded mall, I mean, full of people. And of course, I was just begging him and pleading with him to find him. And he said, I've been trying.
Milke made numerous calls, one to her father in nearby Florence, Arizona, another to police, and a little later one to her mother, Renata Janka, who was living in Switzerland.
She was hysterical, absolutely hysterical. And I said, now listen, just tell the police everything that you know and what he wore and whatnot and so forth. She says, Mom, I've given them photos, I've told them everything.
Debbie did not call the boy's father, Mark Milke. He was notified by police. He says he immediately suspected the worst.
I didn't believe that he just wandered off, that it just wasn't Christopher. Like hiding and not letting anybody know where he was. And somebody at the mall would have seen him.
By nightfall, authorities had found no trace of Christopher at the mall. They decided to broaden the search.
They plastered his face on the TV news and in the print media.
Reporter Paul Rubin covered the story for the Phoenix New-Times.
I mean, this cute little kid, and his little bangs, and all of a sudden, I mean, everybody was looking under every rock for the kid.
That evening, a Phoenix detective began questioning Milke's roommate, 42-year-old Jim Stiers. Stiers explained that he had borrowed Debbie's car to go Christmas shopping. He said Christopher had begged to go along to visit the mall's Santa Claus, and the boy's mother had let him go. According to Stiers, they did a few errands, had a quick lunch, then headed to the mall where their first stop was the bathroom. Detective Charles Massino had Stiers retrace his steps inside the bathroom. He wanted to know which stall Stiers had been sitting in. Private investigator Paul Hubel looked into the case on behalf of a local television station.
Stiers points to one of the stall doors, that one. But Charlie was pretty slick. He walked over and opened the door to the stall, and he saw something quite amazing, and there was no toilet seat. Are you telling me you went to the bathroom in that? And he says, oh yeah, man, I really had to go. And that just didn't ring true.
After detectives put more pressure on Stiers, he revealed that there'd been a third person with them that day, a friend of his named Roger Scott.
Roger Scott was kind of a marginal guy. He didn't work. He lived with his mom. He seemed to be a follower of James Stiers.
Both men were now considered prime suspects in Christopher Milke's disappearance. Shortly after midnight, detectives located 41-year-old Roger Scott at his home. He agreed to come down to the station, and detectives sat him down for a lengthy interview.
Roger Scott wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer.
Today's date is the 3rd of December, 1989.
He just wilted under hours upon hours of interrogation, and finally he broke.
Scott confessed that he had been part of a plot with his friend Jim Stiers to kill Chris Milke.
Jim and I had talked about it a few times. Finally, the day came, and I didn't think that Jim would go through with it, but he did.
Scott said that Stiers and the boy had picked him up at home around 11 a.m. From there, they ran errands and stopped for pizza. Then, instead of going to the mall, they drove into the desert northwest of Phoenix. They told Christopher they were going to hunt snakes. Roger Scott says Stiers led the boy into a dry creek bed, where they disappeared behind a thick wall of brush and cactus.
I heard the gun go off 3 times. I picked him up, went back to Metro Center, and that's when he contacted the security saying that Christopher was lost.
Scott's confession went further. He told authorities it was the boy's mother, Deborah Milke, who instigated the plot and had offered them money to kill her 4-year-old son.
What did she say,
That,
as best as you can recall?
that she just had to get away from him, and she just wasn't cut out to be a mother, and that she wanted us to take care of it.
There was also some money involved in this too, right? In the form of an insurance policy?
Yes, of $5,000.
One day after the boy's disappearance at about 5 p.m., Scott led police to the crime scene. They found the body of 4-year-old Christopher Milke just as Scott told them they would, in a dry riverbed with 3 bullet holes in the back of his head. Within hours, authorities would say they had solved the crime. A Phoenix police detective named Armando Saldate would announce that he had coaxed a full confession from the boy's mother, in which she admitted to being the ringleader of the murder plot. It seemed a horrible case had been solved through solid, timely police work. But was Debbie Milke really a heartless killer who valued her free time over the life of her only child? Her supporters would question that assumption and the confession that had supposedly cracked the case.
It's the sloppiest, most disgraceful police work I've ever seen in my life.
Phoenix, Arizona, December 1989. Roger Scott, James Stiers, and Deborah Milke were all charged in the murder of 4-year-old Christopher Milke. According to authorities, Milke and Scott both implicated themselves. James Stiers did not.
He stuck with his story that the boy was missing. And Roger Scott confessed and Deborah Milke confessed. So they were all arrested, they were all indicted, all had the same charges.
The boy's mother, Debbie Milke, was said to be the ringleader, which raised the question, who was she? An ordinary single mother, scratching out a life under tough circumstances, or a self-absorbed killer? Her background showed neither criminal behavior nor violence of any kind. But according to the authorities, it did show a motive for murder. Deborah Jean Sadek was born in a U.S. military hospital in West Berlin in March 1964. Debbie soon had a younger sister, Sandy. Their parents were Air Force Tech Sergeant Richard Sadek and his German wife, Renata. The family moved frequently, finally settling back in the U.S. at Luke Air Force Base near Phoenix. According to Renata, Debbie's father drank heavily, and the marriage was tense and combative. Debbie's parents divorced when she was 14.
I was married to Richard Sadek, well, on paper for 16 years, but we separated after 12 years of marriage. It was a shock for the children, yes it was, but I think we managed okay.
Debbie and her sister Sandy, however, could not manage to get along. Debbie was attractive and popular and tended to overshadow her younger sister. The girls became rivals, if not at times enemies. Debbie stayed with her mother. Sandy eventually went to live with their father. A year after Debbie's high school graduation in May 1982, her mother took a marketing job at a technology firm in her native West Germany. 19-year-old Debbie, who was taking classes at a community college, stayed behind and lived in their Phoenix apartment.
There was a void in her life because Mom was not there at home anymore.
She left Debbie in charge, and she moved in like 3 or 4 of her girlfriends. It was like a nonstop party flophouse.
It wasn't long before Debbie met a 21-year-old carpet layer and former exotic dancer named Mark Milke. They married in December 1984, when Debbie was 20. She immediately became pregnant.
I was ecstatic, and so was she. I mean, she tackled me at the door one day coming in from work. My stick turned blue, my stick turned blue.
In October 1985, Debbie gave birth to Christopher Conan Milke.
Having Christopher gave a lot of meaning to my life. I had a sense of purpose, and I found direction. I felt very happy and complete.
He was a 100% pure adrenaline kid. I was beaming, and so was she for a while, and then I think she started to get scared, question her own ability to be a mother.
It wasn't long before Deborah Milke's attempt at family life fell apart. She says her frustration with Mark's alcoholism and his repeated jail sentences for drunk driving led to their divorce in November 1988. Debbie and her son moved from place to place, at one point sharing a house with a saleswoman for an electronics firm named Susie Stinson. Stinson quickly noticed how Debbie's dating life conflicted with her role as a mother.
She had a way with the guys. Guys were very attracted to her. And sometimes I think she used them. She could play a very sweet act with them. And sometimes I think Christopher got in the way with that. That was an issue. It would interfere with her guy life.
Debbie had what on the surface seemed normal struggles for a young single mother. At age 3, Chris had developed a thyroid condition, which made him hyperactive. Debbie tried to make ends meet on a secretary's salary at an insurance firm. In July 1989, Debbie and her son moved in with an acquaintance named James Stiers and his 2-year-old daughter.
He, was very attracted to Debbie, and he wasn't mentally all there. He was like a little puppy dog following Debbie around. I think she used him, but I think he was really infatuated with her.
While Debbie Milke worked full-time and went out frequently, Stiers had nothing but time on his hands. He would often look after Chris as well as his own daughter.
Somebody there for Christopher, and that's the way I looked at it. You know, a responsible person around. When Debbie would be out all night, at least there would be somebody there.
Jim Stiers was unemployed, and his only income came from government disability checks. He had served in Vietnam and took lithium for depression, as well as another drug to help silence the voices he claimed to hear. According to authorities, this made him a prime target for the manipulative Debbie Milke when she got so fed up with being a mother that she decided to get rid of her son. They would argue that Milke hired her roommate Jim Stiers and Stiers' friend Roger Scott and offered them part of Chris Milke's $5,000 life insurance policy to murder him.
She just became obsessed with herself and her own selfishness. She didn't like her life. She didn't like Chris. She didn't like to be burdened with him.
In her prison interview with American Justice, Debbie Milke denies she had anything to do with her son's murder.
I didn't conspire with anybody. I wasn't there. I didn't murder anybody. I loved my son more than anything. So I tried to be a good mother, yes. And being a mother was something that I absolutely enjoyed.
Milke now says she has no idea why Stiers or Scott may have murdered Christopher. In the past, she has theorized that Stiers did it because he was in love with her. Today, she says she doesn't want to speculate.
I really would rather not say, because I'm just not sure about some things. I don't know why Jim would do this. The person that I knew would never do anything like that.
According to Phoenix Police Detective Armando Saldati, Milke told him a much different story during a 30-minute interrogation that was not tape-recorded. Saldati claimed Milke had made a full confession to her involvement in the crime. His police report of the confession would turn out to be critical. Jim Stiers would later admit he went with a boy and Roger Scott to the desert, but always insisted the murder was Scott's spur-of-the-moment idea. The state offered Roger Scott a deal to testify against Milke about the alleged conspiracy, but Scott rejected the offer. That meant, at Debbie Milke's trial, the biggest thing standing between freedom and a possible death sentence was the word of Detective Saldati. The boy's father, Mark Milke, was stunned by the news, but believed that his ex-wife could have done it.
Big-time betrayal. I mean, big-time shock. It's like one big explosion happening. And I don't even know how I survived it.
Debbie Milke's trial would begin 9 months later, in September 1990, at the Central Court Building in downtown Phoenix. The 26-year-old faced a possible death penalty. Prosecutor Noah Levy had the difficult task of proving a mother could hire 2 men to kill her own son in cold blood.
I'm prosecuting a mother and accusing her of having her son killed. I really was unsure how the jury would accept this.
Prosecutors also had to prove a conspiracy without a money trail, a weapon, or testimony from either of the alleged co-conspirators. Roger Scott had led police to the boy's body and had told authorities that Debbie Milke had offered to pay him and Jim Stiers part of the $5,000 insurance payout. But he turned down a deal to testify at Milke's trial. That left prosecutors with Debbie Milke's disputed confession to Phoenix Detective Armando Saldati. Saldati's 7-page account of his 30-minute interview was the centerpiece of the state's case. According to prosecutors, it showed a self-seeking, manipulative woman who had her child murdered just to get on with her life.
To try to categorize her personality, it seemed to would be of obsessive selfishness and disregard for the lives of others in order to fulfill your own goals.
She decided that it'd be best for Christopher Milke to die.
Detective Saldati took a riveted jury step by step through his police report that documented the confession. At the beginning, Saldati had written, Deborah did not admit to her involvement in the conspiracy, but did admit that she had been feeling sorry for her son because of his father's negative influence.
She started talking about Mark Milke and how he was, abused drugs and alcohol at the time. He'd been in and out of jail or prison.
She did not want him to grow up like her husband, Mark Milke.
According to the detective, Milke eventually opened up and told of her involvement in her son's death. Saldati quoted Milke as saying, "Look, I just didn't want him to grow up like his father. I'm not a crazy person. I'm not an animal."
And she said, if I didn't kill the boy, Mark, would be with him, and the only solution was to kill him.
Saldati testified that Milke approached her roommate Jim Stiers about committing the murder.
She said she had a hard time at first trying to tell Jim about what she wanted, but that finally she probably got the nerve up enough to tell Jim, and Jim agreed.
The detective reported that Debbie knew exactly when the murder was going to happen and did nothing to stop it. The account was a damning portrait of a callous woman who, as soon as she was done confessing to the conspiracy, remarked, "I guess I just made a bad judgment call." During cross-examination, Milke's court-appointed attorney, Ken Ray, questioned the way Saldati had prepared his report.
Her husband, Mark Milke.
The detective said that he'd taken handwritten notes during the one-on-one interview and later typed them up into a tersely worded document. Saldati acknowledged paraphrasing most of Debbie's statements in his report, then throwing out the notes.
If you've got a confession from somebody, you want that to be witnessed. You want it to be signed. You want it to be recorded because you've got it.
Former DEA agent Kirk Fowler worked for Milke's defense and attended the trial.
I don't want to be sarcastic, but that's what they do in beautiful downtown Baghdad. Police officer, they says, "Oh, I got a confession." That's it. It's the most disgraceful police work I've ever seen in my life.
In the witness box, the 21-year police veteran stood his ground.
He was very believable, good presenter. Has probably had a lot of experience on the stand.
The state backed up the testimony of the detective with one character witness after another. Some of them testified that Debbie was an irresponsible, manipulative woman. Among those witnesses was Debbie's own sister, Sandy Pickenpaw. Sandy testified that Debbie had neglected Christopher, often trying to pawn him off on friends and relatives, leaving him in their care for days or even weeks at a time.
She had trouble dealing with Christopher. Christopher was high-strung. She often found herself scared because he would stress her to the point where she would feel violent.
Sandy gave the packed courtroom one other reason why her older sister might have wanted to get rid of her son. She testified that Christopher interfered with Debbie's relationship with an ex-boyfriend named Ernie, who had broken up with Debbie a month before the murder.
She told me that Ernie was in love with her, that Ernie wanted to marry her, but that Christopher was a burr in his side. He did not want to be an instant father.
Deborah wanted to go with someone who could provide her a better life, and if it took sacrificing Chris for that, as part of the motive, then she was willing to do it.
Milke's father also testified for the prosecution. He said that Debbie would try to get money out of him by withholding visits from his grandson. Milke tried to explain why her family testified against her.
I was devastated that they would desert me the way they did, but at the same time I wasn't surprised because as far as my sister, she has a tendency to be vindictive and spiteful.
Ballistics evidence never made it clear who shot the boy out in the desert. But prosecutor Noel Levy argued it was Milke's roommate, Jim Stiers. Stiers, he said, had two incentives for participating in the plot. A cut from the $5,000 life insurance payout and the hope of a sexual relationship.
She's the one who was the puppeteer who moved Stiers' strings. She was the mastermind of the conspiracy to kill the boy.
Up next, the jury would get the chance to weigh the integrity of the most important witness, 21-year police veteran Armando Saldati, against the testimony of a frightened 26-year-old woman, because Deborah Milke would take the stand in her own defense. In Phoenix in the fall of 1990, 26-year-old Debbie Milke was on trial for her life, charged with coercing two acquaintances into murdering her 4-year-old son, Christopher. Milke's court-appointed attorney, Ken Ray, planned a straightforward defense. He called a string of witnesses, most of them neighbors and friends, to testify that Debbie was a loving mother. Defense investigator Kirk Fowler had assembled most of these witnesses.
I mean, usually somebody that's going to do something really horrible does some minor things first and they work up to it. There's nothing like that in Debbie's background. I mean, zero. There's absolutely nothing.
But according to Fowler, Milke's character witnesses fell flat in comparison to the testimony of Debbie's father and sister.
I think the jury probably thought that, well, if her family says all this bad stuff about her, she must have done it. The family didn't say anything that she did it. They just said she's bad and rotten and no good.
On October 1st, 1990, Deborah Milke took the witness stand to try to turn the tide. In a nervous, monotone delivery, Milke told the jury about her last day with her son and seeing him off with her roommate, Jim Stiers.
Well, he had heard Jim mention that he wanted to use my car to go back to the mall, and he got excited and asked, "Can I go? Can I go? Santa Claus was there last night and I want to see him again."
Milke then described her reaction when Stiers called to tell her that Christopher was missing.
I was hysterical. I couldn't talk straight. I remember I was screaming into the phone and my dad kept telling me to calm down, that it's normal for children to get lost at this time of the year.
Debbie spent 5 days in the witness chair. Her primary goal was to cast doubt on Phoenix detective Armando Saldati's report of her confession. According to Milke, she made no such confession. She said she had gone voluntarily to the sheriff's office in Florence, Arizona, unaware that her son's body had been found. She was waiting for the detective in a small room. Saldati entered and ordered everyone else to leave. In her telephone interview with American Justice, she gave her version of what happened next.
Mr. Soldati rolled a chair directly in front of me, said my son was found murdered and that I'm under arrest for it. And I immediately screamed out to him, "What?"
Until this minute, she had no idea what even happened to her child. And he tells her, "Your child has been murdered." She just lost her mind.
While I was sitting there crying and sobbing, he was reading Miranda rights. And I could hear what he was saying, but I really wasn't comprehending. He asked about being taped, and I just looked at him and I was confused, and I said, "Taped? No."
Debbie's refusal to be tape recorded is one of the few facts she and the officer agree on. She testified that she spent much of her 30-minute interrogation trying to fend off Saldati's aggressive questioning.
He sat back in the chair and he said, "I'm not going to tolerate this type of activity from you," because I was crying and I wouldn't say anything.
Debbie Milke refuted entirely the substance of Saldati's report.
There was absolutely no confession whatsoever. I totally disagree with his entire account of his report. He completely twisted things I said, and some statements he attributed to me were completely made up. I did not make a confession to that man at all. He said, "I'm here to question you."
Milke and her defense team had hoped her performance on the stand would make a positive impression.
The truth. I was hysterical.
But her testimony may well have had the opposite effect.
She just didn't come across as sympathetic. She didn't come across as emotionally devastated by the death of her son. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the worst, Debbie was like a 9+ in terms of a bad witness.
At the time, Milke was taking an anti-anxiety drug to help control her emotions. She defends her performance.
Just because I was not over-emotional in front of a packed courtroom, that doesn't mean that I wasn't feeling anything. I was hit with a double tragedy. My only child was murdered, and I was on trial for my life. I didn't want to, quote, lose it.
After 14 days of testimony on October 11th, 1990, the case went to the jury. A guilty verdict could mean a death sentence for Deborah Milke. On October 11th, 1990, a Phoenix jury began deliberations in the case against Deborah Milke, accused of orchestrating a plot to kill her 4-year-old son, Christopher. With no physical evidence linking Debbie to the crime, jurors had to decide who was telling the truth about a disputed confession. They also had to decide whether to accept the prosecution's portrayal of Debbie as a deceptive, cruel woman capable of plotting the death of her child. After 1 day of deliberation, the jury foreman announced a verdict.
We find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree.
I remember feeling devastated. I mean, that didn't even enter my mind at all. I didn't think it would even come to that.
Milke's ex-husband Mark told reporters he thought the jury made the right decision. Prior to the verdict, he said he had feared Debbie might manipulate her way out of trouble.
I was pretty confident, but there's a lot of things that she's talked her way out of through the time that I've known her.
But private investigator Paul Hubel watched the same trial and was perplexed.
I sat through that trial, and my question was, where's the beef? I couldn't see the beef. You know, what's wrong? How come I don't see it? What's missing?
The private eye pursued the jurors, who refused to comment. Hubel hounded them until one finally talked to him.
I said, well, wait a minute, why don't you just tell me one thing? What was the single biggest piece of evidence to cause you to convict Deborah Milke? I thought I knew the answer. I thought she was going to say, why, it was the confession. That's not the answer she gave.
To most people, Detective Soldati's report of the confession seemed to be the key piece of evidence. But the juror told Hubel that something else sealed Milke's fate. She recounted that the panel was split until the bailiff brought them what she simply referred to as the tape.
And I go, tape? What tape? I sat through that trial. I don't recall the tape. She says, that's just it. The tape was never played during the trial.
The audio tape contained a conversation between Debbie's sister, Sandy Pickenpaw, and Detective Armando Soldati. It had been entered into evidence by prosecutors and quoted during the trial, but hadn't been played for the jury. Why the jury chose to listen to it during deliberations is unknown. What they heard is not.
When was the last time you talked to your sister?
My son's birthday, November 11th.
The beginning of the conversation was innocuous, but as it continued, it reinforced Sandy's harsh testimony about her older sister's personality.
She's a master of manipulation. That's probably foremost more than anything else. Deborah has a way with people. She puts on this facade that makes people feel so sorry for her that they're willing to do just about anything.
The juror told Hubel that after the panel listened to the tape, whatever doubts they had evaporated, and they voted unanimously to convict. 3 months after the conviction, in January 1991, Judge Cheryl Hendricks decided that Debbie Milke should be put to death for her crime. Milke and her defense team were stunned.
I just remember standing there, and I was just frozen. I couldn't believe what she had said. And then after we left the courtroom, I remember going back to the county jail and just totally falling apart.
Since that day, Milke has lived on Arizona's death row. No execution date has been set. According to law, she could choose either death in the state's gas chamber or lethal injection. Milke's appellate attorneys believe there are a number of reasons why the conviction and sentence should be overturned. First and foremost, they point to Detective Soldati and Milke's disputed confession.
Well, number one, was there a confession? is this something that Soldati had manufactured, the police officer? And there is maybe a history of tainted confessions in his cases.
The defense attorneys insist they need more information about the detective. At trial, Judge Hendricks denied a defense request to examine Soldati's personnel files. An appellate judge is now deciding whether to grant the defense access to the files. They are hoping to find that the 20-year veteran has some skeletons in his closet.
It's not like I'm the first person he's done this to, or the only person. I think he's arrogant, and you give him a badge and a gun, and he thinks he's God.
Milke's appellate attorneys cite ineffective assistance of counsel as another reason why her case should be overturned. They contend that her court-appointed attorney, Ken Ray, should have objected to the admission of Sandy's interview tape as irrelevant and inflammatory.
This was her sister, you know, just painting Deborah like you would paint anybody who you despised and hated and was jealous of. Very damning garbage, you know. Nothing that would be considered admissible, because it's just, I call it character assassination.
Finally, Milke's attorneys believe trial judge Cheryl Hendricks consistently and unfairly ruled against them.
We asked for money and time. We asked to look at personnel records for Soldati. That was all denied. I'm not saying she got paid off or anything. I'm just saying she was so prejudicial to this.
A few years before Milke's trial, Judge Hendricks had received a public censure from the Arizona Supreme Court for what the court called careless decisions that violated the canons of judicial conduct. In 1997, she was dismissed from hearing criminal cases. Debbie Milke says all of these issues add up to a wrongful conviction.
This was like a circus. There was nothing fair about it. I was just a normal person working a full-time job trying to support a child and myself. I didn't break the law. It's not just me. Wrongful convictions in death penalty cases are popping up all over this country. There's a serious problem here.
Prosecutors defend Detective Soldati's police work and their case. They are confident that Deborah Milke's guilty verdict and death sentence will stand.
This is a solid case. I mean, it was well investigated, fully developed, completely litigated, no errors of any consequence.
She's definitely earned the place she's at. This was called the crime of the decade in Phoenix. She deserves it more than a lot of others on death row.
Milke's mother, Renata Janke, has led a campaign in her native Germany to bring attention to her daughter's plight. She says she opposes the death penalty because it's impossible to remedy a mistake once an innocent person is put to death.
I don't think it is right to try to find out when it's too late. Something has to be done. I hope it changes. And I hope we will be successful and I can take my daughter home with me.
And the law says today in Arizona that a police officer can get you alone for 10 minutes, you can be executed. You don't need no witnesses, no evidence, no nothing. Sad.